December Blue Trails Guide webinar. My name is Faye Augustin, and I'm the Associate Director for the Colorado River Basin Program. I'm very excited that so many of you are here today to hear the first presentation in a series that we're doing on the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act as a part of our Blue Trails Guide webinar series. A couple quick things before we get started into the presentation itself. As always, if your connection is lost or you have challenges with the GoToWebinar system, you can go ahead and log in again using your unique web link and passcode that was provided to you when you registered with GoToWebinar. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available next week on December 20th for viewing at bluetrailsguide.org/blog. We'll also be sending around a link to the recorded webinar as well as additional resources on Wild and Scenic next week. And if you have any other challenges while the webinar is taking place, please feel free to email me. My email is on your screen right now. As a part of our webinar series, we encourage a lot of questions and answers. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. In your GoToWebinar side panel, you have a questions box. Feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar in that box, or we'll leave about 5 minutes at the end of the webinar where you're welcome again to ask other questions. And those questions that we are not able to answer, we will share after the webinar. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce my colleague, Cassie Heron, who lives in the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana, just south of Missoula. She is a part of our Northern Rockies team of American Rivers and leads outreach and advocacy efforts as a member of the Montanans for Healthy Rivers Coalition. The goal of this coalition is to usher the passage of legislation that would designate dozens of new rivers in Montana as wild and scenic. In her free time, she can be found on the river in the company of her 3 canines and her human partner. So Cassie, I'll go ahead and turn the webinar over to you.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Faye, and thanks for all who are attending today. This is a real pleasure for me to kind of share some of my knowledge. Also, as sort of a beginner to Wild and Scenic Rivers, I have been working with American Rivers for 3.5 years now. And so I'm also still learning every day. So I appreciate you all chiming in as well with questions, and even colleagues of mine who might be out there that know a lot about this too. Feel free to chime in, type in question and answer as well. So here, here is me enjoying a river, a Montana river, with one of my canines, and the largest brown trout I've ever caught. So for those anglers out there, I'm sure you'll appreciate this. So I live in Victor, Montana, as Faye said, western Montana in the Bitterroot Valley, south of Missoula. And I conduct a lot of the outreach and advocacy efforts as a part of our coalition, Montanans for Healthy Rivers. And so just to kind of jump right in to sort of a background onto the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, I kind of have about 3 phases to this presentation. The first just being a little bit of history, the second being applications of the Act, and the third just being a couple of clarifications on some common questions that we receive about the Act. So in the mid-1930s, in response to the Great Depression, the United States entered the New Deal era, where an enormous emphasis was placed on infrastructure development projects across the country. And so for about the next 20 years, we would see the largest development projects that the modern world had ever seen here in the U.S. And this continued for another 20, 30 years or so. And to date, the Army Corps of Engineers catalogs about 80,000 dams across the country, larger than 6 feet. And this has resulted in approximately 600,000 miles of river that are either blocked or altered by dams, or roughly 20% of the nation's river miles. A statistic that one of my colleagues points out and always just makes me pause when I hear it is that this total number of dams is 1 dam built per day since Thomas Jefferson was president. Around this same time, conservationists, biologists, and river recreationists were noticing that many of their beloved places were being altered by some of these water development projects. And in some states, there were already early legislative efforts to protect certain rivers from harmful development. But as a nation, we still lacked a comprehensive system of protected rivers. And so the idea for the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was actually born on the Middle Fork Flathead here in Montana. And so this photo you see in the background is a photo of the Middle Fork Flathead in northwestern Montana. And this picture in the bottom right, these gentlemen are the Craighead brothers, John and Frank Craighead. And they were known for their research on grizzly bears and grizzly bear habitat in the Flathead region. And so the idea for the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was actually born here with the Craighead brothers. In 1957, there was a proposed dam called the Spruce Park Dam, which would have been built on the Middle Fork Flathead, about 6 miles up from the confluence of Bear Creek in the Middle Fork Flathead. And so the Craighead brothers knew that this area was critical grizzly bear habitat and a grizzly bear corridor, that if a dam was constructed, it would put about 3,000 acres underwater, decimating the area and the important habitat. And so they really thought that there should be protection for rivers like the Middle Fork Flathead that, with its outstandingly remarkable values, should remain free-flowing in nature. So for the next 10 years, there would actually be 16 different bills introduced around this concept of a national system of protected rivers. And in a State of the Union address in 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson remarked that there needed to be a balance between river development and protection for future generations. And so finally, on October 2nd in 1968, President Johnson signed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act into law. And really the purpose of this was to establish a national policy of dam and other construction at appropriate sections of the rivers of the United States, and that this needed to be complemented by a policy that would preserve other selected rivers in their free-flowing condition, to protect the water quality of such rivers, and to fulfill other vital national conservation purposes. So again, really the rationale behind the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was not just to stop dam construction in its tracks. It was to say, let's take a pause and recognize that there are other values for which rivers need to be managed, and to balance out that construction and development by providing for those values. And with this first enabling legislation, there were 8 rivers totaling 789 miles. And those rivers were the Middle Fork, Clearwater in Idaho, 11 Point River in Missouri, Feature River in California, the Rio Grande, the Rogue, the St. Croix, the Middle Fork Salmon, and the Wolf River in Wisconsin. So there are actually 2 ways to become a wild and scenic river. One of those, which is this is how most rivers become wild and scenic, is through the passing of legislation in Congress. This would be a bill introduced and passed by Congress and signed into law by the President. The second way that a river can become wild and scenic is through a petition by the state to the Secretary of Interior. And in order for that to happen, there has to be a state-established system of protected rivers. And so once a state legislature creates a state system of protected rivers, the governor can petition to the Secretary of Interior to include those rivers into the national system. So in order for a stream to be considered eligible for wild and scenic status, well, it has to be free-flowing. And free-flowing, that's applied to any river or section of river existing or flowing in a natural condition without impoundment or diversion or riprapping or other modification of the waterway. However, the existence of low dams and diversion works or other minor structures at the time that a river is proposed for inclusion will not bar it from inclusion into the system. And then secondly, a river must or stream must possess one or more outstandingly remarkable values. So these remarkable values can be anything from scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife habitat, historic, cultural, or other similar values. So once a river is designated, it's classified in 3 different ways. And the first would be a wild river. And so here I have a couple examples of rivers that are classified as wild. And really this just means free from impoundments, dams, or diversions. And these rivers are generally inaccessible except by trail, where the watersheds or the areas surrounding the river are primitive and shorelines are essentially undeveloped. The second classification are scenic rivers, and these rivers are also free from impoundments and in general undeveloped areas, but can be accessible in places by roads. And then finally, we have recreational rivers. And these rivers are readily accessible by road with some shoreline development and possibly subject to some impoundment or diversion in the past. And so for all these rivers, it's also important to note that many of them can be further divided. So for instance, I have here a photo of the Missouri River in Montana. So in Montana, even within the 150-mile stretch of the Missouri River that's designated wild and scenic, about 60 miles of that river are wild, 20 are scenic, and another 60 are recreational. So even within one river, there can be several different classifications of wild and scenic. And it's important to remember that all classifications still receive the same level of protection under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And so just a few, kind of moving into the second phase of the presentation, sort of how the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act protects rivers. This is actually a photo of my sister. She doesn't know that she's world famous today, but this was from a trip we took up on the North Fork Flathead, which is one of Montana's 4 wild and scenic rivers. And when a river is designated wild and scenic, a river corridor is established alongside of that river. And so technically this is 320 acres per river mile, which averages out to about a quarter-mile corridor on each side. And this just allows for the land management agency to manage within that corridor appropriately for those river values. Sort of the strongest protection of a wild and scenic designation is that free-flowing character must be preserved. So no large-scale federally licensed dam projects can be put in place once a river is designated. That free-flowing character must be preserved. Secondly, third, protection of outstandingly remarkable values. And so I already spoke to this a little bit, but this can be anything from scenic, recreational, fisheries, wildlife, habitat, cultural, historical significance, those values must be managed for and prioritized under a designation. Water quality must be maintained or enhanced. So this is in conjunction with EPA and Clean Water Act, but this is a non-degradation standard from the time of designation, and that's applied to all federally permitted projects. So it's like taking a snapshot of a river's current condition, water quality standard at that time, and ensuring that it's managed in a way that maintains that current condition. That's why we also like to refer to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act as sort of a status quo maintenance law. And then a comprehensive river management plan is also created. So whether it's the Forest Service, National Park Service, BLM, whatever federal land management agency might be administering management of the Wild and Scenic River corridor, a comprehensive river management plan has to be created after designation to appropriately manage for the various values for which that river was designated. And this is a really important way for especially the public and other important stakeholders to get involved and to voice their concerns and just participate in that public process and really engage the public in making a lot of those management decisions for the river. So some other really important uses of a Wild and Scenic River designation is that unlike wilderness designation, which we'll get into a little bit later as to kind of the difference, it's the only standalone protection of streams that we have in this country that manages and protects strictly for the river and river corridor itself. It's also important to note that this designation is often used or applied to rivers on public lands, especially here in Montana where we're advocating for designation. We're designating almost exclusively on federally managed public lands. And so it's another avenue to participate in the conversation of how our federal lands and rivers are managed so that river values are prioritized. And in a lot of cases, those are often headwaters areas, especially here in Montana. So we get that headwater protection and that corridor protection alongside of those rivers. It also allows for more consistent management across watersheds. For instance, here in Montana, we have existing wild and scenic designations on the South Fork, Middle Fork, and North Fork of the Flathead. So we're advocating for quite a few of the tributaries, important tributaries to those existing wild and scenic stretches. And that's really to allow for more consistent management on a watershed scale. And then finally, a wild and scenic designation often can facilitate the allocation of additional federal funding for things like restoration or access or easements or anything that might help in protecting those river values or promoting those river values. And that can only really happen if there is an official designation. So some items that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does not affect, and these again are just common ones that come up a lot in our public meetings and conversations, but of course there are others. People are usually concerned about how the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act will impact private property or local development. And so what's important here to note is that a Wild and Scenic designation does not trump any local development regulations. If there's local planning or zoning, any kind of development that happens or is requested in those areas will go through the local sort of chain of command with those sorts of projects. The only way that a wild and scenic designation would come into play is if a federal permit was required for some sort of activity. And even then, the wild and scenic designation has to be recognized as a part of issuing a federal permit. Existing water rights and interstate water compacts are not impacted. In fact, once a designation occurs, it's sort of like Western water law, first in time, first in right. Any water rights that are applied for are junior to any existing water rights that occur, so there's no impact there. Outfitting, trail building, and horse packing, this comes up a lot, especially in our area, and that's a picture here actually of an outfitter leading a hunting trip in the South Fork Flathead, Wild and Scenic. So there's not any impact to that as far as existing permits and access. For motorized and mechanized activities, again, there's nothing that's stated specifically in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that does not allow for this. And so, again, this kind of goes back to the general rule of thumb, which is this is a snapshot in time or status quo idea, where if a use existed at the time of designation, it will generally be allowed to continue. For instance, an example would be motorized boat use on the Wild and Scenic Maine salmon. That is permitted. Public or private access, again, some folks are concerned that if, you know, there's a Wild and Scenic designation, it will automatically open up their land to public access, and that is not the case. Private land remains private and public land remains public. And fishing and hunting regulations are still typically administered through the state departments of natural resources, and so those are not taken over by the federal government in any way. And so one question that comes up is wild and scenic versus wilderness. So here in Montana, quite a few of the rivers we're advocating for designation happen to run across wilderness areas, which often prompts the question, well, why would you worry about those rivers if they're already protected by wilderness? And so a little known fact about the Wilderness Act is that it does permit through executive order the development of dams and diversions on rivers within wilderness areas. And while this authority has never been exercised before, the potential threat is there for a future situation or president who might decide that there's a necessity to impound rivers in wilderness. Therefore, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is important because it closes that loophole and protects the river itself from that potential threat. And another question we're often asked is that if a river is designated wild and scenic and there's private property within the corridor, if there's a threat of condemnation or taking of that property. And so the only way that a piece of property could be obtained by a federal land management agency administering the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act within that corridor is through a voluntary sale of property of the owner to the agency. And there also a few conditions that would prohibit this authority entirely. For example, if more than 50% of land ownership within the river corridor is already in public ownership, additional purchase of the private land is prohibited. And it's also important to note that condemnation has only been used a handful of times in the history of the Act, mostly within the first 10 years of its passing on rivers that were designated in 1968 and 1976. And most of these were for easements and not for private land purchases. So we like to show this map. It's a cartogram map that shows the size of the state in proportion to the number of wild and scenic river miles in that state. And as you can see, a lot of the bulk of those are in the western U.S. and northwestern U.S. and Alaska. So to date, we have 208 designated rivers as wild and scenic and roughly 12,700 river miles, but that still comes out to less than 1/4 of 1% of the U.S. rivers. And so I know there are quite a few folks on the webinar here that are probably engaged in some of these campaigns. So I didn't list them all, but I listed a few campaign efforts. One of those being American Rivers 5,000 Miles of Wild campaign, and there's a link here to accessing that campaign, and you can see on that page a list of all of the various efforts across the country that we're engaged in. One of those being Montanans for Healthy Rivers Coalition, which I'm a part of, and a close neighbor would be the Nooksack Wild and Scenic campaign in Washington. And so this is just to give you a sense of a few of the campaigns that are going on. And then I also thought it would be helpful to list a few resources. Most of the information that came out of my presentation today can be found in either Tim Palmer's book, Wild and Scenic Rivers of America, which is a great history on the Act. Rivers.gov has a ton of links to resources, publications, and technical papers. And then, of course, there's the Nationwide Rivers Inventory. And American Whitewater, one of our close partners, also has a really helpful national whitewater inventory. And so I guess with that, Faye, question and answer time.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Cassie, for that really helpful and interesting presentation on the background and a beginner's guide to wild and scenic rivers. So as Cassie mentioned at this point, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions and answers, a short question and answer session. As I mentioned before, there is a question box in your GoToWebinar side panel that I would encourage you to ask questions in if you haven't already. So we'll take a couple minutes to answer some questions here. Cassie, one of the questions that came up right away was, what are some of the challenges that you faced or that have been faced as it relates to designating wild and scenic rivers?
Oh man, do we have another half hour? Some of the challenges I think with getting that designation is movement in Congress. You know, that's the most popular way and most effective way really to get a river designated wild and scenic is the introduction of legislation and having Congress vote in support and having it signed into law. And so I just think in the last few years it's been really difficult kind of in general to get bills moved forward, but we have seen some success. We have had a wild and scenic bill introduced for the last couple of sessions in Congress. And so I think what's really important is having a lot of local support. For instance, our East Rosebud Wild and Scenic bill that's been introduced and has been introduced again this year. What really gets that moving is having a ton of local support. And so, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks, Cassie. Another question is kind of more specifics on the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act itself. Does it protect against mining at all within a Wild and Scenic River corridor?
So yes. Now, if there are existing mining claims, it doesn't necessarily prohibit those mining claims from being exercised. This is actually a really complicated issue, and it can also depend on where, you know, this designation occurs, if it's a wild river, if it's scenic, it's recreational, and what kind of the claim situation is in that area. But sort of the short answer is that yes, typically any kind of mining activity that would require a Clean Water Act permit would have to prove that there was not any impact to the wild and scenic values of that river corridor. So it can make it very difficult to prove that, and because there cannot be any degradation to water quality at the time of designation. So it's very difficult you know, to show that there's not going to be some sort of impact to water quality through those activities.
Great.
And in some
Thanks, Kathy.
cases, yeah, and in some cases, if it's a wild river, there have been examples of mining claims being retired, or, you know, the Forest Service or whatever the land management agency being able to buy back those claims. So there are some examples, and I'd be happy to share those in more detail if folks are interested.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Another question that we have, and this might be our last one, just given that we are coming up on the 11:30 time here in Mountain Time. How does a Wild and Scenic River designation start? Who determines if a river is eligible to become a Wild and Scenic River?
Well, there are a lot of different efforts. You know, within our coalition, we've even conducted eligibility inventories. Typically, the Federal Land Management Agency has to put together an eligibility inventory itself. For instance, as a part of the Forest Service planning process, they must inventory all of their rivers and determine eligibility for wild and scenic designation. And so a lot of that's done at the federal level with either the Forest Service, Park Service, BLM, whoever it might be. But there's a lot of opportunity for the public to also lend their experience and their knowledge to that process. And so really, again, if it's free-flowing and if it has an outstandingly remarkable value, it's eligible.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. And there are a few additional questions that have popped in the last couple of minutes that, given the time, we do not have time on the webinar to answer. However, I will work with Kathy to complete a brief answer that we'll share as a part of the email and on our blog that we send out next week with the recorded webinar. So we'll send out the recorded webinar, some of the helpful links and resources that Kathy sent, along with a transcript of the questions and answers that we pulled together. So I wanted to thank everyone who joined us today for our first, again, in a series of Wild and Scenic webinars on the Blue Trails Guide webinar series. So please stay tuned for our webinar in January, and then our second webinar on the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in February. So thank you again, and have a really great rest of December and holiday season, and we'll see you all back in January.
Thank you, Faye. Thanks, everyone.